Fidel Castro, one of the most iconic and polarizing figures of the 20th century, was born on August 13, 1926, in Biran Oriente, the easternmost province of Cuba. His early life and family background provide a fascinating glimpse into the circumstances that would shape his revolutionary ideology and future leadership. Castro's father, Ángel María Bautista Castro y Arguez, was born in 1875 in Galicia, a rugged and impoverished region in northern Spain. In the early 1890s, Ángel was conscripted into the Spanish army and sent to Cuba, one of Spain's few remaining colonies in the Americas, to suppress the Second War of Independence that erupted in 1895. This conflict, unlike earlier independence struggles, ultimately succeeded due to the intervention of the United States. Following Spain's defeat in 1898, Cuba gained independence but fell under the geopolitical and economic influence of the United States, a relationship that would profoundly shape its history in the 20th century. After his military service, Ángel briefly returned to Spain but emigrated to Cuba permanently in 1905. Over the next 2 decades, he worked various jobs, including as a laborer for the American-owned United Fruit Company. By the 1920s, Ángel had established a thriving agricultural business, employing over 300 workers, many of whom were hired out to sugar plantations. His business success forged strong connections with American companies operating in Cuba, ensuring the family's relative affluence. In 1911, Ángel married Maria Argota y Reyes, with whom he had 5 children. However, their marriage ended in collapse, and Ángel formed a relationship with Lina Ruz Gonzalez, a farm servant who became his mistress and later his second wife. Together, they had 7 children, including Fidel and his younger brother Raúl, who would become Fidel's closest political ally. Fidel's birth out of wedlock in a deeply conservative society added a layer of complexity to his upbringing. Initially, he was registered under his mother's surname and raised alongside the children of sugar plantation workers, many of whom were Haitian and other Caribbean laborers enduring poverty and hardship. These early experiences exposed Fidel to the stark inequalities of Cuban society and likely influenced his later views on class, imperialism, and the role of American business interests on the island. At the age of 6, Fidel and his elder siblings, Ramon and Angela, were sent to Santiago de Cuba to begin their education. Their living conditions were far from comfortable, as they resided with a tutor who could barely afford basic necessities. Despite these challenges, Fidel's parents prioritized his education, ensuring he attended some of Cuba's most prestigious schools. In 1934, Fidel was baptized, a notable event given the predominantly Roman Catholic culture of the island. This was likely a practical decision to facilitate his enrollment at La Salle, a Catholic boarding school. Following this, Fidel attended Jesuit-run schools, including Dolores School in Santiago and El Colegio de Belén in Havana. While he demonstrated an interest in history and geography, his academic performance was unremarkable. However, Fidel excelled in athletics, which helped shape his competitive and determined personality. The socio-economic landscape of Fidel's childhood was one of stark contrasts. While his family enjoyed relative privilege, he was acutely aware of the struggles of the laborers who toiled for his father. This juxtaposition of wealth and poverty, along with Cuba's semi-colonial status under U.S. influence, planted the seeds of a revolutionary outlook in the young Fidel. The island's economy was heavily dependent on sugar exports, with American corporations controlling significant portions of its resources and infrastructure. This dynamic fostered resentment among many Cubans, creating fertile ground for the revolutionary movements that would later emerge. Fidel's early years were marked by contradictions. Born into privilege yet exposed to poverty, educated in elite institutions yet living among the working class, he developed a complex understanding of Cuban society. These formative experiences laid the foundation for his later ideological transformation. In 1943 and 1944, Fidel Castro was named Havana's most outstanding sportsman of his age, excelling in baseball, basketball, the high jump, and middle distance running. His athletic prowess, combined with his growing interest in politics, defined these formative years. Castro was growing up during a period when Cuban society was in chaos. In the decades following the country's War of Independence in 1898, Cuba experienced profound political instability and poor economic development. The political system was highly corrupt. Much of this corruption was driven by American business interests, which controlled large parts of the Cuban economy. The island also became a haven for the Italian mafia and other criminal organizations based in America. Meanwhile, the Cuban economy remained underdeveloped. The 1930s saw increasing military intervention in Cuban politics, particularly following the so-called Revolt of the Sergeants in 1933. As a result, the overall leader of the military faction, Sergeant Fulgencio Batista, began to play a major role in Cuban politics. Batista served as president between 1940 and 1944. After this, he left to live in Florida in the United States, but would later return to Cuban politics with striking consequences. In 1945, Fidel Castro began studying law at the University of Havana. Here, his political instincts first began to manifest as he became involved in several student protest movements against the pervasive corruption of Cuban politics and the elites who ran the country. It was a contentious time on Cuban university campuses, where armed gangs were common and engaged in widespread criminal behavior, a reflection of the wider breakdown of law and order across Cuban society. During these years, Castro's anti-American stance first emerged. He joined the Committee for the Independence of Puerto Rico, a body advocating for the neighboring Caribbean island to be granted independence from the United States. Puerto Rico had effectively become an American colony following the Spanish-American War of 1898. Castro and his fellow student agitators in Havana opposed this arrangement, viewing it as a symptom of America's strategy to dominate the Americas and oppress the states of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. It was during these years in Havana that Castro first gained a reputation within wider Cuban society for his dissident actions. In the winter of 1946, he appeared in several newspapers following his criticisms of the government's corruption and violence. He subsequently developed extensive connections with numerous left-wing political groups within the country, notably the Union Insurrectional Revolutionaria, or Insurrectional Revolutionary Union. At the time, police suspected him of the murder of a rival student leader. While Castro earned a reputation for powerful oratory, he never became a prominent student leader himself and was defeated in campus elections on several occasions. In the summer of 1947, Castro left university briefly to join a campaign to overthrow the right-wing government of Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Like Batista in Cuba, Trujillo was a military governor supported by the United States. In late July of that year, Castro was one of the leaders of a band of about 1,200 rebels who set off from Cuba for the Dominican Republic with the goal of overthrowing Trujillo. The effort, however, was quickly suppressed by a combination of U.S., Cuban, and Dominican forces. Many were arrested, although Fidel escaped after he reputedly jumped overboard from the ship he was on into shark-infested waters, carrying a gun above his head. This event is noteworthy for being the first occasion on which the future Cuban leader engaged in direct armed rebellion in the Caribbean. Following the abortive expedition to the Dominican Republic, Castro entered into a period in which his revolutionary activities expanded. He was increasingly prominent within student protest circles against the government in Havana, while during the course of 1948, he undertook a number of trips to Panama, Venezuela, and Colombia. In particular, in the capital of Colombia, Bogotá, in the late spring of 1948, he was central to efforts to set up a Pan-American Students' Conference, which would act in opposition to right-wing governments across Latin America. Meanwhile, back in Cuba, later that year, he married Mirta Díaz-Balart, a philosophy student. It was regarded as an unlikely union, as Balart came from a prominent Cuban family with extensive connections to the country's political elites, the very individuals and groupings whom Castro was increasingly appearing to be an outright opponent of. The couple even received extensive gifts on their wedding day. Despite these curious contradictions, the marriage lasted for 7 years. Fidel and Mirta had a son named Fidelito before divorcing in 1955. In the early 1950s, Castro established a law firm with 2 associates named Jorge Azpiazu and Rafael Resende. However, these were fellow leftists, and in reality, the firm was engaged in pro bono work. Moreover, Castro was developing his knowledge of leftist thought during these years, reading widely the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the 2 pioneers of communism, and other, more recent political thinkers, such as Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. At this stage, Castro was leaning towards changing Cuba from within. In 1952, he stood for election to the Cuban Congress in the national elections as a member of the Partido del Pueblo Cubana, Ortodoxos Party, a Cuban catch-all left-wing populist party founded by Eduardo Chibas in 1947. This was actually the beginning of the end of Castro's peaceful approach to changing Cuban politics. In the same year, 1952, Fulgencio Batista returned to the political scene in Cuba, and within months had established a new military dictatorship in the island nation following a brief military coup. He would henceforth rule Cuba as a one-party military dictatorship with the backing of America. Castro now set out on a path to overthrow the Batista regime through violent means. Within weeks of the return of Batista to power in Cuba, Castro was working on a new revolutionary project, which he and his followers, such as his younger brother Raúl Castro, called the movement. Their first action came within months and was a significant moment in the Cuban Revolution. On the 26th of July, 1953, Castro and around 100 others attacked a Cuban army barracks at Moncada in Santiago de Cuba. The attack was a complete failure. Nearly half of the militants were killed by the 400-strong garrison. Most of the remainder were taken captive, with just a few escaping altogether. Fidel was amongst those who were captured, and he was subsequently sentenced to 15 years in prison for leading an insurrection against the state. During his trial, he delivered a lengthy defense in what would become his most famous speech. La historia me absolverá, history will absolve me, in which he attacked Batista's regime and outlined his own political and economic ideas. Castro served his sentence on the Isla de Pinos, the second largest island in the Cuban archipelago. While in captivity, he rebranded the movement as the 26th of July movement. Despite this continuing incendiary behavior, Batista took the decision to release Castro from prison in the summer of 1955, after having served less than 2 years of his sentence. It was a decision the dictator would soon come to regret. After the revolution's triumph, Castro wasted no time in consolidating his power. He and Guevara spearheaded sweeping changes, starting with agrarian reform. In May 1959, the Agrarian Reform Law was introduced, expropriating large landholdings and redistributing them to peasants. This was both a practical and ideological move, aligning Cuba with Marxist principles while also undermining the powerful elites. At the same time, Castro's government launched campaigns to nationalize key industries, including sugar plantations, utilities, and oil refineries. This quickly alienated American businesses and investors, many of whom saw their assets confiscated without adequate compensation. By the early 1960s, the United States imposed a trade embargo on Cuba, a move that would define U.S.-Cuban relations for decades to come. Politically, Castro worked to eliminate opposition. Thousands of Batista loyalists and political dissenters were arrested or executed in show trials. The judiciary was purged, and the press was brought under state control. Meanwhile, committees for the defense of the revolution were established across the country to monitor and report on counter-revolutionary activities. These measures ensured that Castro's grip on power became increasingly unassailable. As tensions with the United States escalated, Castro solidified his alliance with the Soviet Union. In February 1960, he signed a trade agreement with Moscow, which included the exchange of Cuban sugar for Soviet oil and economic aid. This relationship deepened following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, when a U.S.-backed force of Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Castro's government. The botched invasion was a propaganda coup for Castro, allowing him to position himself as a defender of Cuban sovereignty. By the end of 1961, Castro publicly declared himself a Marxist-Leninist. His move to align Cuba fully with the Soviet bloc brought the island to the forefront of the Cold War. The most dramatic moment came in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war after the Soviet Union installed ballistic missiles on Cuban soil. Though the crisis was ultimately diffused, it cemented Cuba's role as a thorn in America's side and a key player in global geopolitics. Domestically, Castro implemented sweeping social programs aimed at eradicating illiteracy, expanding healthcare, and improving education. By the mid-1960s, Cuba boasted some of the best health and education indicators in the region, achievements that even his critics acknowledged. However, these gains came at the cost of political freedoms and economic stagnation. As the years progressed, Cuba's economy became increasingly dependent on Soviet aid. This dependency left the country vulnerable, a reality that would have significant repercussions when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Nevertheless, during the Cold War, Castro's Cuba served as a beacon for revolutionary movements across the globe. Under his leadership, Cuba provided material and military support to leftist insurgencies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, further cementing Castro's legacy as a champion of anti-imperialism. Through it all, Fidel Castro remained a polarizing figure. To his supporters, he was a revolutionary hero who stood up to American imperialism and uplifted the Cuban people. To his detractors, he was a dictator who suppressed freedoms and plunged his country into economic hardship. His reign would leave an indelible mark not just on Cuba, but on the world stage. Relations between the Castro regime and the United States deteriorated rapidly during the early days of Fidel Castro's government. One of the pivotal moments that exacerbated tensions came when Castro initiated the nationalization of American business interests in Cuba. This sweeping move, which targeted major industries, banks, and utilities owned by U.S. corporations, sent shockwaves through Washington. It was perceived not only as an economic blow, but as a direct challenge to American influence in the Western Hemisphere. The animosity between the two nations deepened in September 1960 when Castro attended the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. There, he made a deliberate and provocative show of aligning himself with regimes that openly opposed the United States, including Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The Cuban leader's defiance on the world stage captured global attention, as his rhetoric was laced with anti-imperialist and anti-American sentiments. This act further cemented Cuba's pivot towards the communist bloc and escalated tensions with its northern neighbor. By this point, the United States government, under the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower, was already engaged in covert efforts to destabilize Castro's regime. Millions of dollars were funneled into initiatives designed to undermine his government, ranging from propaganda campaigns to plans for military intervention. These efforts intensified as Eisenhower's presidency gave way to that of John F. Kennedy, who was elected in late 1960. By the time Kennedy took office, the groundwork for a large-scale intervention in Cuba had been laid. Central to this strategy was the involvement of Cuban exiles who had fled the island after Castro's rise to power. Many of these individuals had settled in Florida and other parts of the United States, forming a vocal and determined counter-revolutionary community. By early 1961, a paramilitary unit known as Brigade 2506, along with a political wing called the Democratic Revolutionary Front, was working closely with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. To avoid domestic and international scrutiny, the exiles were trained in Guatemala, where they prepared for a full-scale invasion of their homeland. The plan, developed with CIA oversight, called for some 1,400 Cuban paramilitaries to launch a naval assault on Cuba, supported by advanced U.S. military equipment, including B-26 bomber planes and M-41 tanks. The operation, however, was doomed from the outset. Despite meticulous planning, the mission would unravel disastrously and leave a lasting impact on U.S.-Cuban relations. On April 16, 1961, the invasion force departed from Nicaragua and Guatemala by boat. The day before, U.S. aircraft had bombed several sites in Cuba in an attempt to weaken Castro's defenses. Then, on the morning of April 17, the paramilitaries began landing along the southern coast of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, a remote inlet in the Gulf of Cazones. Almost immediately, the operation ran into significant difficulties. The invaders were met by local militias, resulting in a shootout that alerted Castro's government to the unfolding invasion. Fidel Castro's response was swift and decisive. From Havana, he ordered Captain José Ramón Fernández to organize a counterattack, while he personally oversaw the broader operation. Within hours, Castro's forces launched bombing raids that targeted the invaders' fleet, cutting off their escape route. The initial invasion plans had included significant air support from the U.S., but President Kennedy's administration, wary of provoking a larger conflict, had withdrawn this crucial element of the operation. Deprived of air cover and with their exit strategy blocked, Brigade 2506 found themselves surrounded. Over the next 3 days, Castro's forces systematically dismantled the invasion. By April 20th, the operation was over. Brigade 2506 surrendered, with 118 men killed in action and hundreds more wounded. Over 1,200 paramilitaries were captured by Cuban forces, delivering a resounding victory to Castro and a humiliating defeat to the United States. The aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion had profound consequences. For Fidel Castro, it was a moment of triumph that bolstered his regime's legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. He framed the victory as a triumph of Cuban sovereignty over American imperialism, using it to galvanize support for his government and further suppress dissent within the country. In the United States, the failed invasion was a foreign policy debacle for the Kennedy administration. It exposed Washington's covert attempts to overthrow a foreign government and highlighted significant flaws in the planning and execution of the operation. Although Kennedy managed to negotiate the release of over 1,000 captured paramilitaries in 1962 in exchange for $50 million worth of food and medicine, the damage to U.S. credibility was done. The debacle pushed Castro further into the arms of Moscow. Within weeks of the invasion, negotiations between Havana and Moscow intensified, leading to expanded trade agreements and military cooperation. By December 1961, Castro publicly declared himself a Marxist-Leninist, formally aligning Cuba with the Soviet bloc. This ideological commitment solidified Cuba's place as a key player in the Cold War and set the stage for future confrontations, including the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. This invasion cemented Castro's image as a defiant revolutionary leader and ensured that the hostility between Washington and Havana would endure for decades to come. American planes and ships were quickly dispatched to the Western Caribbean to monitor all vessels attempting to enter Cuba, ensuring that their cargoes did not include war materials. The gravity of the situation escalated when President John F. Kennedy delivered a live televised address to the nation on the evening of October 22, 1962. In this historic speech, Kennedy firmly stated that any attack launched from Cuba against any country in the Western Hemisphere would be considered an act of aggression by the Soviet Union against the United States. In his address, Kennedy outlined the purpose of the quarantine, a naval blockade designed to prevent further shipments of Soviet military hardware to Cuba. He carefully distinguished this action from the kind of total blockade implemented by the Soviet Union during the Berlin blockade of 1948. Unlike the complete shutdown of supplies into West Berlin, the quarantine allowed for the continued flow of essential goods to Cuba, emphasizing that its sole aim was to intercept military shipments. This nuanced approach was intended to maintain international support and avoid unnecessarily escalating the crisis. In the days that followed, the situation reached a boiling point. The international community became increasingly engaged, with allies on both sides ramping up their rhetoric and expressing readiness to support their respective camps if the conflict spiraled into outright war. On October 24th, Pope John XXIII issued a heartfelt plea for peace, urging both superpowers to consider the catastrophic consequences of their actions. Despite these calls for restraint, tensions continued to mount. Fidel Castro maintained that the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba was a purely defensive measure. However, the critical response awaited was that of Moscow. Early indications were troubling. On the same day, October 24th, Soviet news agencies broadcast a telegram from Nikita Khrushchev to Kennedy. In this message, Khrushchev labeled the quarantine an act of military aggression and demanded its immediate cessation. This statement marked a significant escalation, as it underscored the Soviet Union's resolve to stand firm against U.S. actions. The world appeared to teeter on the brink of nuclear war. American forces intensified their readiness, with hundreds of bomber planes, including nearly 24 nuclear-armed B-52 bombers, taking to the skies. Meanwhile, U.S. officials called for an urgent meeting of the United Nations Security Council to address the escalating crisis. The critical days of October 25th, 26th, and 27th witnessed some of the most intense moments of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Diplomatic channels between Washington and Moscow remained open. Tensions on the ground and in the air continued to escalate. U.S. naval forces rigorously enforced the quarantine, intercepting and inspecting ships headed for Cuba to ensure they were not carrying nuclear warheads or other military supplies. A breakthrough in negotiations began on October 26th, but events nearly derailed these efforts. An American U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba by a surface-to-air missile. Khrushchev later claimed that this action had been taken on the orders of Fidel Castro's brother, Raul, without direct authorization from Moscow. This incident dramatically escalated the stakes. In Washington, plans were drawn up for a full-scale invasion of Cuba if another U.S. aircraft were shot down. However, restraint prevailed as both sides recognized the catastrophic consequences of further escalation. By the evening of October 27, a diplomatic resolution began to emerge. The U.S. and Soviet Union reached an agreement. The Soviet Union would dismantle its missile installations in Cuba and withdraw its nuclear weapons from the island. In return, the United States pledged to remove its own nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, which had been a point of contention for Moscow. Furthermore, Kennedy provided a private assurance to Khrushchev that the United States would respect Cuba's sovereignty and refrain from future invasions or direct interventions, like the Bay of Pigs. This agreement allowed both superpowers to save face. The Soviets could claim they had secured a pledge from the U.S. not to invade Cuba, while the U.S. presented the removal of the Soviet missiles as a major victory. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile sites in Cuba, bringing the 13-day crisis to an end. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in Cold War diplomacy. In its aftermath, the United States and Soviet Union recognized the urgent need for improved communication to prevent similar crises in the future. As a result, a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow was established, enabling the leaders of the two superpowers to communicate swiftly in times of crisis. For the Cold War itself, the crisis ushered in a period of cautious de-escalation. Though tensions remained high throughout the 1960s, both sides began exploring arms control agreements and other measures to reduce the risk of nuclear conflict. The most notable of these was the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. For Cuba, the resolution of the crisis solidified Castro's regime. The U.S. commitment not to invade Cuba ensured that Castro's government would remain in power, allowing him to further align his country with the Soviet Union. In 1963, Castro visited Moscow and other Soviet cities, strengthening the alliance between the two nations. This partnership brought economic aid and military support to Cuba, securing its position as a key Soviet ally in the Western Hemisphere throughout the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the most dramatic and consequential episodes in modern history. It highlighted the catastrophic potential of nuclear weapons and the urgent need for diplomacy and restraint in international relations. The events of those 13 days continue to serve as a sobering reminder of the dangers of brinkmanship and the importance of dialogue in averting global conflict. As a result of Fidel Castro's state visit to the Soviet Union in 1963, a new phase of Cuban governance began. The visit not only solidified the ideological alignment between Cuba and the Soviet Union, but also inspired Castro to implement a series of reforms across Cuban society, the economy, and the political structure. These reforms closely mirrored the Soviet model, with an emphasis on centralized planning, collectivization, and the establishment of a one-party state. Consequently, Cuba entrenched itself as a staunch adversary of the United States, maintaining its role as a geopolitical thorn in America's side throughout the Cold War. For its part, the United States continued to adopt punitive measures against Cuba, imposing stringent economic, diplomatic, and trade sanctions. These restrictions aimed to isolate the Castro regime and pressure it into abandoning its communist policies. The embargo had profound and lasting implications for Cuba's economy, creating a precarious situation that exacerbated the challenges faced by the island nation in subsequent decades. The 1960s were marked by significant economic difficulties for Cuba. A combination of American sanctions, mismanagement by Castro's administration, and the inherent challenges of transitioning to a socialist economy contributed to a prolonged period of economic decline. The country remained heavily dependent on its traditional sugar industry, a reliance that left it vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity markets. Meanwhile, other burgeoning sectors, such as tourism and the casino industry, which had thrived during the pre-revolutionary period, saw a sharp decline under the new regime. The nationalization of private enterprises and the exodus of foreign investors further compounded these issues. To sustain its economy, Cuba increasingly relied on subsidies from the Soviet Union. By the late 1960s, Soviet aid accounted for nearly 40% of Cuba's GDP. These subsidies included preferential trade agreements, financial aid, and technological support, which temporarily alleviated some of the economic strain. However, this dependency highlighted the fragility of Cuba's economic model, tying its fortunes closely to the Soviet Union's own economic health. Despite the setbacks of the 1960s, the Cuban economy experienced a period of relative improvement during the 1970s and 1980s. State-led investments in agriculture, industry, and infrastructure yielded moderate growth, even as global economic conditions stagnated. The diversification of trade partnerships within the Eastern Bloc and other socialist-leaning nations also provided a buffer against economic shocks. However, the decline of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and its eventual collapse in 1991 plunged Cuba into a new era of economic hardship, known as the Special Period. The withdrawal of Soviet support exposed the vulnerabilities of Cuba's centralized economic system, leading to severe shortages of food, fuel, and other essential goods. This period underscored the limitations of the Castro regime's economic policies and the long-term consequences of its reliance on Soviet aid. Fidel Castro's rule led to the transformation of Cuba's healthcare system. Building upon a foundation that was already among the most advanced in Latin America prior to the revolution, the government undertook significant reforms to make healthcare universally accessible and free for all citizens. These efforts began in earnest during the 1960s, spurred by the loss of medical professionals who emigrated to the United States in the aftermath of the revolution. The Cuban government invested heavily in training new doctors, building hospitals, and expanding medical services to rural and underserved areas. By 1976, the country's commitment to healthcare was enshrined in Article 50 of the Cuban Constitution, ensuring it remained a national priority. The results were remarkable. The doctor-to-patient ratio improved dramatically, rising from 9.2 doctors per 10,000 individuals in 1958 to nearly 60 per 10,000 by the end of 1958, the 20th century. Cuba's healthcare achievements extended beyond basic care. The country became a leader in medical innovation, pioneering treatments and interventions that gained international recognition. Notably, Cuba developed a groundbreaking lung cancer vaccine and achieved significant success in controlling the spread of HIV. Infant mortality rates in Cuba fell to levels lower than those in the United States, and life expectancy rose to 79 years, comparable to developed nations. Alongside healthcare, education was a cornerstone of Fidel Castro's vision for a socialist Cuba. Following the revolution, all educational institutions were nationalized, and the state assumed full control over the education system. This centralization allowed for significant investment and reforms aimed at eradicating illiteracy and ensuring equal access to education for all citizens. In the years immediately following the revolution, the government launched an ambitious literacy campaign that mobilized thousands of volunteers to teach reading and writing skills across the country. By the end of the campaign, illiteracy rates had plummeted, earning Cuba international acclaim for its educational achievements. The government continued to prioritize education in subsequent decades, allocating as much as 10% of the country's gross national product to the sector. This level of investment was roughly double the average expenditure of neighboring nations, reflecting the importance placed on education within the Castro regime. By the 1990s, Cuba had one of the highest literacy rates in the world, and its schools and universities produced a highly skilled workforce that contributed to advancements in science, medicine, and the arts. The economic, social, and political trajectory of Cuba under Fidel Castro's rule is a study in contrast. While the country achieved remarkable progress in areas such as healthcare and education, these successes were often overshadowed by the economic hardships and political repression that characterized much of Castro's tenure. The reliance on Soviet support and the impact of American sanctions created a precarious economic situation that left Cuba vulnerable to external shocks. Yet, despite these challenges, the Castro regime managed to carve out a distinct identity for Cuba on the global stage, one that continues to inspire debate and analysis to this day. By the turn of the millennium, Cuba had established itself as a global example of literacy and educational achievement. The literacy rate among young adults exceeded 97%, a remarkable transformation from the pre-revolutionary period. The 1998 UNESCO study, highlighting Cuban students' superior performance compared to peers in developed nations, further validated the success of the nation's education reforms. This extended to higher education, particularly institutions like the University of Havana, which not only advanced academic standards domestically, but also attracted international students. The strides made in gender equality in education further underscored Cuba's progressive policies under Castro's leadership. In tandem with these domestic achievements, Fidel Castro began to position Cuba more prominently on the global stage. While the country had been firmly embedded in the Soviet bloc during the early Cold War years, the 1970s saw a strategic shift. Castro aligned Cuba with the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM, a coalition of developing nations seeking a path independent of both the United States and the Soviet Union. Although initial skepticism surrounded Cuba's involvement due to its close ties with Moscow, Castro skillfully navigated these concerns. By the late 1970s, his presidency of the NAM marked a pivotal moment in Cuba's international diplomacy, emphasizing the nation's sovereignty and its dedication to the ideals of anti-imperialism and global solidarity. Despite distancing politically from the Soviet Union, Cuba's economic reliance on the superpower remained significant due to the ongoing U.S. embargo. Nevertheless, Castro leveraged Cuba's geopolitical position to support revolutionary causes worldwide, a policy deeply influenced by the legacy of Che Guevara. Following Guevara's tragic death in Bolivia in 1967, Castro intensified Cuba's involvement in supporting leftist movements globally, viewing this as a continuation of their shared revolutionary mission. Africa became a focal point of Cuban foreign policy during this period. Castro famously described the continent as the weakest link in the imperialist chain, and this perspective drove Cuba's deep engagement in African liberation struggles. In Angola, Cuba played a decisive role in the protracted civil war that erupted following the nation's independence from Portugal in 1975. Castro's government dispatched military advisors and later full-scale troop deployments to assist the Communist People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, against U.S.-backed factions. This intervention in Angola was unprecedented in scale and commitment. Between 1975 and 1991, over 370,000 Cuban troops and an additional 50,000 civilian personnel served in Angola. This extraordinary mobilization meant that nearly 5% of Cuba's population contributed to the Angolan conflict in some capacity, demonstrating the depth of Castro's ideological commitment to international solidarity. The Cuban role in Angola not only strengthened the MPLA's position, but also symbolized the extent of Cuba's influence as a revolutionary power on the world stage. Cuba's involvement in Africa extended beyond Angola. Castro's administration supported revolutionary movements and governments in countries such as Ethiopia, Somalia, and Madagascar, often in direct opposition to Western interests. These engagements underscored Castro's belief in fostering global resistance to imperialism, even at significant cost to Cuba's resources and manpower. Interestingly, while Cuba's military and ideological engagements in Africa were intensifying, diplomatic overtures toward normalization of relations with the Western Hemisphere were also emerging. Leaders like Canada's Pierre Trudeau and Mexico's Luis Echeverría worked alongside U.S. President Jimmy Carter to explore avenues for improved ties with Cuba. These efforts represented a tentative thaw in the icy relations between Cuba and its northern neighbors, though they would ultimately falter due to shifting political dynamics. By the late 1980s, the world was rapidly changing, and the foundations upon which Cuba had built its post-revolution economy and global alliances were starting to erode. The Soviet Union, which had long been Cuba's lifeline through economic aid and trade, was itself experiencing profound economic and political upheaval under Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These reforms aimed at modernizing the Soviet state inadvertently weakened the Soviet economy. For Fidel Castro, these developments posed an existential threat. The subsidies provided by the USSR, amounting to billions of dollars annually, had allowed Cuba to sustain its centrally planned economy, even in the face of the United States embargo. With the Soviet Union withdrawing support and the global political climate shifting, Cuba was increasingly isolated on the world stage. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a watershed moment for Cuba. Almost overnight, the island lost nearly 80% of its trade and economic aid. This triggered what came to be known as the Special Period in peacetime, a prolonged economic crisis marked by severe shortages of food, fuel, and basic goods. Cuba's economy contracted dramatically, and the government was forced to introduce austerity measures to prevent a total collapse. To address these challenges, Castro implemented a series of pragmatic, albeit temporary, economic reforms. These included legalizing the use of U.S. dollars, opening the country to limited foreign investment, and permitting some private enterprise. The state also promoted urban farming initiatives to mitigate food shortages. These measures, while inconsistent with traditional communist doctrine, were deemed necessary to ensure the survival of the revolution. Despite these efforts, the special period took a devastating toll on the Cuban population. Malnutrition became widespread, and electricity blackouts were frequent. Public transportation collapsed, and many Cubans resorted to using bicycles or horse-drawn carts as alternatives. Yet in the face of these hardships, Castro's regime managed to maintain its grip on power. The resilience of the Cuban people and the strength of state propaganda played a significant role in sustaining public support during this period. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, Castro sought to diversify Cuba's international partnerships. He cultivated stronger ties with countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, emphasizing solidarity with developing nations. Notably, Castro aligned with Venezuela under Hugo Chavez in the late 1990s, creating a mutually beneficial relationship that saw Cuba receive oil in exchange for sending doctors and other professionals to Venezuela. Cuba also expanded its role in global healthcare diplomacy during this time. Cuban doctors were dispatched to numerous countries as part of medical aid missions, enhancing the country's reputation as a leader in public health. This strategy not only bolstered Cuba's international standing, but also brought in much-needed foreign currency through the services provided. While the special period tested the limits of Cuba's revolutionary ideals, it also demonstrated Castro's ability to adapt to changing circumstances, albeit reluctantly. His government maintained control through a combination of economic pragmatism, ideological rigidity, and strategic alliances. However, the period also highlighted the vulnerabilities of Cuba's dependence on external support and the inefficiencies of its centrally planned economy. As the world moved into the 21st century, Castro's Cuba remained a unique and controversial political entity. A communist state that had survived the Cold War, outlived its Soviet patron, and continued to challenge the global hegemony of the United States. However, the scars of the special period would linger, shaping the nation's trajectory for decades to come. These measures marked a significant, albeit reluctant, shift in Castro's governance. For decades, Cuba had adhered rigidly to communist economic principles, but the severe crisis of the special period forced Fidel to compromise. Private enterprises began to emerge in limited sectors, such as tourism, hospitality, and agriculture, allowing some Cubans to earn incomes independent of the state. The legalization of the U.S. dollar created a dual economy where those with access to dollars, often through remittances from relatives in the United States, were better positioned to weather the economic storm. Cuba's tourism industry became a crucial lifeline during the special period. Fidel's government actively promoted the country as a tropical destination, showcasing its beaches, historic architecture, and vibrant culture. International investors, particularly from Canada and Europe, were encouraged to partner with the Cuban government in developing resorts and other tourism infrastructure. This influx of foreign currency helped stabilize the economy somewhat, but it also created stark inequalities. The rise of tourism introduced a socio-economic divide between those employed in the industry, who had access to dollars and tips from tourists, and those who relied solely on the peso-based economy. This duality strained the principles of equality that had been a cornerstone of the Cuban Revolution. While Cuba experimented with limited economic reforms, Fidel Castro tightened his political control to prevent unrest. Dissent was met with swift reprisals, and the government kept a close watch on intellectuals, activists, and anyone suspected of harboring counter-revolutionary sentiments. The Cuban military and intelligence services were strengthened, ensuring that no significant opposition movement could gain traction. At the same time, Fidel used his charisma and extensive propaganda machinery to maintain support among the Cuban populace. He framed the hardships of the special period as a shared struggle against imperialism, blaming the U.S. embargo for the country's economic woes. This narrative resonated with many Cubans, who viewed their suffering as a necessary sacrifice in the fight for sovereignty and socialism. By the mid-1990s, the economic situation in Cuba remained dire, prompting a surge in attempts to flee the island. This culminated in the Balsero crisis of 1994, during which tens of thousands of Cubans took to makeshift rafts and small boats to cross the Florida Straits in search of asylum in the United States. The images of desperate individuals risking their lives underscored the depth of Cuba's economic crisis and its impact on ordinary citizens. The crisis forced a diplomatic response. In September 1994, the United States and Cuba reached an agreement to manage the flow of migrants. Washington agreed to grant a minimum of 20,000 visas annually to Cubans, while Havana pledged to curb illegal departures. This arrangement eased the immediate migration crisis, but highlighted the broader discontent within Cuban society. Amid the economic and political turmoil of the 1990s, there was a notable shift in Cuba's relationship with religion. In 1998, Pope John Paul II visited the island, marking a historic moment in Cuban history. The visit was seen as a softening of the regime's stance on religion, which had been suppressed following the revolution. The Pope's presence brought international attention to Cuba's struggles and encouraged greater openness in the country's religious practices. For many Cubans, the papal visit offered hope and a sense of spiritual renewal. While Fidel maintained his atheistic worldview, he recognized the value of engaging with the Catholic Church. By the late 1990s, Cuba began to experience a slow economic recovery, aided by the growth of tourism and remittances from Cuban expatriates. The government also formed strategic alliances with nations like Venezuela, which provided subsidized oil in exchange for Cuban medical personnel and expertise. These partnerships alleviated some of the pressures on the Cuban economy, but did not resolve its underlying structural issues. The special period left an indelible mark on Cuban society. It exposed the vulnerabilities of an economy reliant on external support and forced the regime to adopt unorthodox measures to survive. Fidel Castro's temporary transfer of power to his brother Raúl in 2006 marked the beginning of the end of an era for Cuba. For nearly 5 decades, Fidel had been the embodiment of Cuban politics, revolution, and defiance against the West. Unlike Fidel, Raúl was perceived as pragmatic and less ideologically rigid. His leadership style would later usher in reforms that further diverged from the dogmatic socialism of his brother's era. By the time Fidel's retirement was officially announced in February 2008, the international landscape had shifted dramatically. While his prolonged illness kept him largely out of public view, Fidel continued to exert influence through occasional writings, known as reflections and intermittent public appearances. His essays often criticized U.S. foreign policy, reflected on historical events, and commented on contemporary global politics. Raúl's presidency brought about cautious economic and social reforms aimed at modernizing Cuba. These included opening parts of the economy to private enterprise, relaxing restrictions on foreign investment, and allowing Cubans to buy and sell property for the first time in decades. The lifting of travel restrictions for Cuban citizens also marked a significant break from Fidel's era. While Raúl upheld the tenets of socialism, his willingness to engage in dialogue with the United States, culminating in the historic thaw in U.S.-Cuban relations under President Barack Obama in 2014, signaled a departure from Fidel's hardline stance. Fidel, however, was skeptical of these changes. In a rare public appearance during Obama's visit to Cuba in 2016, Fidel wrote an open letter criticizing the U.S. president's overtures, warning of the dangers of American influence and reaffirming his commitment to the ideals of the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro's death on November 25, 2016, at the age of 90, was a moment of profound reflection for Cuba and the world. Officially declared a 9-day period of mourning, his passing elicited polarized reactions globally. In Cuba, thousands lined the streets to pay their respects. As his ashes were transported across the country, in a symbolic reversal of the route he and his fellow revolutionaries had taken to seize power in 1959, international reactions varied. For some, Fidel was a revolutionary hero who had defied the odds to create a sovereign socialist state in the shadow of the United States. For others, he was a dictator whose policies had stifled freedom and plunged Cuba into economic hardship. Leaders from across the political spectrum offered their condolences, with figures like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Pope Francis praising his contributions to global politics. Others, particularly in the United States and Cuban exile communities, expressed relief at his passing. To some, he was the revolutionary hero who stood up to American imperialism and fought for the dignity of the Cuban people. To others, he was a dictator whose policies impoverished the nation and stifled the freedoms of its citizens. His death in 2016 was met with both mourning and celebration, reflecting the deep divisions his life and policies created. The enduring economic sanctions imposed by the United States have undeniably shaped much of Cuba's modern history. While intended to isolate and weaken Castro's regime, these sanctions have had a profound effect on the lives of ordinary Cubans. Over 6 decades of restricted trade and limited access to international markets have stifled Cuba's economic growth. This left the nation reliant on outdated infrastructure and facing chronic shortages of goods. Yet despite these challenges, Cuba under Castro managed to achieve significant advancements, particularly in healthcare and education. These sectors became cornerstones of the regime's legacy, with Cuba developing a robust medical system that has been recognized worldwide. Cuban doctors have served in international missions, and the country's biotech industry has produced notable medical breakthroughs. Similarly, the Cuban education system boasts a near-universal literacy rate, a feat achieved through widespread reforms and accessibility. However, these achievements stand in stark contrast to the political and social realities of Castro's regime. For decades, dissent was met with imprisonment, exile, or worse. The lack of political pluralism and freedom of expression curtailed individual liberties, as Castro and his inner circle maintained an iron grip on power. The fear of persecution drove thousands of Cubans to flee, risking their lives on dangerous journeys across the Florida Straits in search of freedom and opportunity. Fidel Castro's legacy is therefore a study in contrasts. His regime provided a model of how socialism could deliver tangible benefits in healthcare and education, often surpassing those of more affluent nations. Yet this came at the cost of personal freedoms and economic stagnation. His government's oppressive policies and inability to adapt to changing global dynamics left many questioning whether the sacrifices demanded of the Cuban people were justified. As we reflect on Fidel Castro's impact, the debate over his true legacy remains vibrant. Was he a nationalist leader who dared to defy a global superpower and champion the rights of the oppressed? Or was he simply another authoritarian ruler who traded one form of oppression for another? The answer, as with most historical figures, likely lies somewhere in between. Castro's Cuba was a nation of paradoxes, a place where the ideals of equality and justice coexisted uneasily with the reality of repression and economic hardship. What are your thoughts on Fidel Castro's legacy? Do you view him as a revolutionary hero or an oppressive dictator? Share your opinions in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching.